Excited to jump into another interview with Kristin Young, who's the clinical director for the Heron Project. This is another addition to our Getting Through the Holidays After Loss. And I thought what could be really helpful about having Kristin here is, yes, there's loss, but sometimes there's a grief and loss if our loved ones are still in addiction or if we find ourselves in addiction. So in addition to loss, we can also cover a broader topic.
Yes.
So Kristin is the clinical director for the Heron Project. She's worked in the mental health and addictive disorders field for nearly 20 years.
Mhm.
And she's worked with individuals with chronic and severe mental health issues and co-occurring disorders, and has also served in the mental health centers and recovery residences. She specializes in addiction, recovery, trauma, and chronic mental health issues. So really excited you're joining us here today. Thank you so much,
Mm.
Kristin.
Yeah, thank you, Joshua. I'm excited to be here.
So what I thought would be helpful first off is I know because those that are watching may sometimes in our own grief we end up numbing, and sometimes those numbing
Mm.
behaviors end up turning to addiction. I know I did with myself. Some of my coping
Mhm.
mechanisms became addictive,
Yeah.
and it became then shameful and challenging just to face ourselves. So I thought we'd maybe start first with, if anybody's listening and finds themselves in their own addictive issues, what can be helpful to start to navigate through some of those
Yeah.
pieces. And I think we
Right.
can go a little broader as we do into addiction and understanding this.
Yeah, absolutely. I first off, I just wanna say that for human beings, when we're in pain, it
Mm.
is 100% normal for us to move towards the things that make us feel better. We're actually hardwired to do that. So, whenever there's something that makes us feel better, our brain is gonna tell us to move towards it, to use it, right? So, that shame, blame piece that is so prevalent for individuals, families, and just our society, we really have to stop moving away from and understand that this is not a moral and ethical failing for people, that this is normal neurological behavior for somebody that's in extreme pain, right? And I know one of the pieces that was really hit me about your film, your documentary, was this understanding that grief is it's a normal, it's a normal emotion, it's a normal behavior. We're supposed to feel it, right? And so we say that that's pain, right? And then you find substances and it makes you feel better, and your brain remembers that in a very primal way. So that primal part of your brain that can't think is now going to be like, okay, we're still in pain, go towards it, right? And the more we don't activate those grief pathways, right? The and start to process. And by the way, we grieve the loss of our old self when someone's, it's stuck in the grips of addiction. Our families grieve the loss of who we used to be. So there's a lot of grief involved in active substance use, right? There's a lot of hatred, there's a lot of judgment for both self and family members, right? So it's all it definitely does start before a potential loss, right? There's a lot of grief involved in that. So so this idea that we're judging ourselves or other people for just trying to manage their pain in a way that honestly works really well in the beginning. It's like the substance is your best friend, right?
Mhm.
All of a sudden you can function again. All of a sudden it's like a weight is lifted off your shoulders. So why wouldn't you want to use more of it? The problem is not the human. The problem is the way our society manages addiction. And I'm going to include even a lot of the treatment and how we approach it. This is not a failing of the person. This is a failing of the treatment, right? We have to start looking at this as a biological process and not an issue, a failing within the individual themselves.
Yeah, I love what you said because I have a metaphor that I use is the greater the pain or the greater the pressure, the greater the
Hmm.
pleasure. And
Yeah.
then I had my own addictions I struggled with, more sexual related, and I found
Hmm.
went deep down the rabbit hole because it was a thing I couldn't quite fix. And what actually brought me
Right.
grace was recognizing that that was a way that was my protector, and it was actually
Hmm.
learning to befriend those parts of me versus shame, or
Yeah.
because the greater I found, the greater the shame, the deeper into that pleasure seeking, because I had even more pain. And what I could
Right.
start to reframe that is like, oh, this is my protector, so what's he protecting me from? How do I have a little bit
Hmm.
more courage to go within those parts of myself to
Right.
feel what that part is protecting me from feeling? It allowed it to lessen, and then titrating. And I think
Hmm.
there's um, when it comes to substance or anything somebody's using, I think the definition is right if it creates harm, right? So it's like
Yeah.
somebody may be using something and going, oh, I like to take this substance or that substance, but is it creating harm for you or others? May give the signal to say, hey, should I take a deeper look at this? Would
Hmm.
that be fair in your assessment versus somebody saying, hey, I'm struggling with a lot of grief. I need to drink or I need something and to get some out of pain may not be an addiction. It may just be using a substance to feel better. But I
Yeah.
think the individual to feel into, oh, is this actually creating pain and havoc for me and my family? May
Hmm.
give a window to start to go deeper into recovery. Is that fair to say?
Oh, 100%. So, I mean, all of our behavior can be explained by neurology, right? It really can. So, when we think about what's going on in the brain, again, human beings, we are wired to move away from pain, like we were talking about earlier, right? But if you are using a substance that's creating pain or participating in a behavior that's creating pain, and you don't stop when the pain comes, that's a signal that there's a problem. So there's the idea of problem use or problem behaviors and addiction. Those are two separate things. Okay. Problem use is me when I was 20, right? I would go out, I would party, I would drink, I would just like my ex-husband did, who ended up with a substance use issue. Our behaviors were identical. I, around the age of 23, said, I got to stop this. I don't want to do this anymore. I'm not going to make anything of my life. And I ended up going to college and I could control it and he couldn't. And he ended up with substance use disorder. Right. So if a human being is sticking their hand in the fire and getting burned over and over and over again, there's a pathological process that's happening, right? So this is why we can't look at this like it's an individual failing anymore. There is a disease process. Science has proven that there is a disease process that is taking place in the brain, which is why we have these. And we all have some problem behaviors. We all have some problem use. Mine is food. I dealt with a food addiction for many, many years. Substances, I could stop. Food, I couldn't. I'm diabetic now. I have all kinds of issues because of that. And I find when I'm working with families, I can oftentimes get them to understand it in the confines of food because there's a lot of people that have a hard time with that particular craving, right? So they can relate to it. It's not the same, obviously, as a fentanyl addiction, but it's still a recognizable human behavior that we can all relate to because we all have some, whether it's sex, food, drugs, alcohol, right? And even those two, I'm trying not to separate drugs and alcohol anymore because I always want to say alcohol is a drug and we have to start recognizing it as that.
Mhm.
All of this is a disease of dopamine. It's all about dopamine. This is not about the individual addiction or the drug. It's about dopamine, which affects our nucleus accumbens, which is the pleasure center. So when we're in pain, these are the things that activate the pleasure center that give us relief,
Mm,
right? So it's all behavioral. And I often find that people want to focus on the addiction. They want to focus on the substance, like that's the problem. That was never the problem, that was the solution,
mm,
right? It's a solution that creates more problems, unfortunately. But what we have to target is the actual problem. It's the thing that created the pain that caused us to need to numb from it, that caused us to need to escape it, right? That's what we want to talk about more than the substance. I mean, and if you've had your own struggles with addiction, when somebody targets that behavior, what do you want to do?
you just hit shame, so you want to isolate, and then you don't want
Done.
to talk about it because
Hmm.
you already feel shame in the way it is in the
Right.
first place. But I
Hmm.
love the connecting you're doing because it's where I landed once I did a bunch of work to go and face past heartbreak, grief, trauma, abuse, things that would originated and relieve some of the pressure, but the pattern was still there. I could
Yeah.
almost start to see it as just a habitual pattern versus before it was almost unconscious reactionary,
Hmm.
like in my
Hmm. Yeah.
biology. And then I could
Yeah.
start to separate it. And then I started to realize exactly what you said. I'm like, oh, it's dopamine. When my dopamine is low,
Yep.
that part of me turns on almost animalistic to try to get some pleasure.
Hmm.
And so it's a dopamine challenges that we're having, right? So is that the part that
Yeah.
you end up working on with individuals is how to replenish their dopamine?
I think it's part of it. I mean, we have to have such a multifaceted approach to helping people. I think it starts with a lack of judgment. If you want somebody to hear you and you want somebody to sit with you, you have to get to a place where you're not judging. And trust me, as the spouse of somebody who had a substance use disorder, that is one of the most difficult things for family members to do, which is why we need to get our own support, because we have to learn how to manage our own anger and our own triggers and our own feelings instead of, one of the hardest discussions to have with families is to say to them, your anxiety as a result of their choices is your job, not theirs. And instead, what we do is we go to our family members and want them to change their behavior. And when they don't, we get angry and we lash out because we're scared, right? So we want them to stop it so we can feel better. And that's not fair. My anxiety is mine to own. Now, this doesn't mean that there aren't things we can do to help our loved ones move towards wanting recovery. There are, but it starts with us looking at ourselves, right? And the same can be said for somebody who is in the grips of active use, right? It's about, what am I doing? Why am I doing it? I got to get honest, right? You started off asking me, what do we do in the beginning when we're first starting to realize this is something. I have an 18-year-old son whose father has an addiction issue, so I'm terrified. I know that, I mean, this is my work, but it doesn't mean he's safe. Okay, like, it could happen to any of us. So one of the things I've always said to him is, don't lie about it. If you find yourself lying and hiding, that is the first clue that you are in a dangerous road. So get honest. Go talk to somebody. Be honest about what you're doing, right? But that shame keeps us from doing it. But first, you got to find a safe space, because, like, from my ex-husband, I was not a safe space. He couldn't come to me and get honest. There was no way. I would have flipped, right? I would have, because at the time, I didn't know what I know today, and I was anxious. My life was so tied up into his, right? So first, you got to find a safe space, which a lot of people find in the 12-step meetings and things like that, right? But getting honest is step one. And I often say too, you don't have to decide that you have substance use disorder to go to a 12-step meeting. You can walk in the door and just sit and talk to somebody, or just sit and listen and not even say anything. Right? Even people who have problem use, people like me, when I was partying back in the day, would have gotten something out of a 12-step meeting. I would have learned something. It doesn't mean you have to be diagnosable. If you think you have a problem, just go and listen.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And there's so many ways I want to go. I'm just thinking of what those that are listening that have probably experienced some grief, those that may even have a deeper one related to addiction, and
Hmm.
maybe to provide some compassion. You started to go into a little bit deeper of the judgment, because I think that
Yeah.
maybe what happens is like, oh, I'm judging this loved one for what they're doing, and then in my reactions to them, the way I come
Hmm.
across harshly, or something happens and then they die,
They die.
and then I'm
It's
kind of
awful.
left in this like mess. And so
Yeah.
either through helping somebody work through that if they're kind of struggling with their own guilt that they've taken on, or maybe related to like normalizing that piece of
Hmm.
it, or absolving
Oh,
them from some of the shame they're carrying, of like, you're doing the best you could with the tools you have, and you didn't have awareness that this was a disease,
oh,
and thought it
100.
could be
Yeah.
solved, right? So maybe we could talk a little bit more about that.
Oh, I would love to. So early on, when we do virtual support groups, they're all run by licensed clinicians. And unfortunately, and I hope this changes, I often say, one of my goals, one of my colleagues' goals is to work ourselves out of a job, right? We don't want to need to do this work anymore. But right now, our biggest growing demographic for family groups is grief. We're losing a lot of people, and it's devastating, and we've got to figure out how to have that not be the case, but right now it is. And early on, one of the things we found was that we lost people, and when we had been working with these families, we've been trying to help the individuals, and we had nowhere to send them. I did so much research trying to find support groups for people who were struggling with a loved one who passed from addiction, and they really didn't exist at the time. This was now 8 years ago, so, which is why we ended up creating our own. Um, a lot of the people I worked with, the families I worked with, would go to just grief support groups. And there's so much stigma and judgment out there that they would go into a room, and somebody whose loved one died of, say, cancer, wouldn't necessarily have compassion for the way that their loved one passed. Because it's, to some people, they feel like there's a choice. And if you've lost a loved one, you're angry, right? So you lash out around you. So they wouldn't feel comfortable and safe in those rooms. So we had to create a safe space where we could work through that too, right? Because families come, it's a different thing. And a lot of times, I mean, this will kill you as a family member. It will take you right down with it. When somebody's using, they are not themselves. They are the worst version of themselves. And we're only human beings. So we're going to react like a human being who's in pain because our loved one is lashing out on us. They're hiding, they're lying, they're stealing, right? And we have to protect ourselves. And we don't know how. Even when I was in it at the time, I was a very fresh clinician. I had no idea what to do. And I was lashing out, right? So there's nobody's teaching us how to do this. And with every other disease, the what we would do, that whole trying to enable, trying to control, taking care of, it works. With addiction, it doesn't. It's the only one. So as just a typical human, I'm going to do what I know when I know somebody I love is struggling, right? And then it just continues to get worse and worse and worse until I feel resentful. I feel taken advantage of, right? I'm going to get angry. And oftentimes we lose them at that point, right? So we have to normalize that. It's a normal part of an abnormal experience, right? Like what we do in that instance and what happens with families, you can write a book. Everybody's story is just as different as it is the same, right? Like all of us, when I sit in a room and I talk to families about this and I tell them some of the things I did, I punched my ex-husband square in the face one night. Like I didn't even know I knew how to throw a punch. Joshua, I had no idea. Like it was all those kickboxing classes, I guess, because I had never gotten in a fight in my life. I broke his glasses and I made him bleed, right? And that was I was like a caged animal backed against a wall at that point. I couldn't even control my body. I had lost complete touch. We don't recognize ourselves anymore when we're in this, right? And then we have work to do. The next day I got myself in therapy. That was the first time I ever got into therapy myself because I was like, this is not a version of me I like. And I have to own my own behavior, right? But the fact that that disease got me there, it's a normal part of the process for most families. And I often say what I want to be able to do with that is teach families to get to a place where they can keep themselves safe so they don't feel that way anymore. They can control their own behavior and they can stay in it because oftentimes we have to turn our backs on our loved ones just to survive, right? And again, then you lose them. And then because you lived through this, then what does that feel like? It feels like you abandoned them, right? And it's self-preservation. You know what the heck to do. It's an awful disease. You were just trying to save yourself. We get to that point. I have to save either me or you. We can't both be saved in this. And then we feel the guilt and the blame and the survivor's guilt and all that stuff that comes on the other side of it. Right. So yeah, that's a common experience in our grief groups. That's why we created that space. It's also why we have them led by licensed clinicians because we want there to be some safety in the room. We want somebody to be able to control it. They've been, I mean, they're amazing. Our groups, they travel across the country because they're all virtual and they'll travel across the country and meet each other without even our intervention. And it's amazing when you think about a virtual space that can create that level of cohesiveness. Um, I also want to say they're free. I always have to point that out because everyone expects that, they probably cost a certain amount of money or they're only for people that have some sort of privilege or good insurance. They're all free. Everything we do is free. So anybody can join. There's no exchange of insurance. You can come when you want. So it's a very safe space for people to come and process their grief and be there when they need to and pull back when they need to. And it creates a lot of really great supports, both peer related and professional.
Yeah, I wish I would have had more awareness when I was going through it because I was in my own little box and no, I didn't feel like
Yeah.
anybody understood and could relate and felt a lot of judgment, even just inherently in people's language. They don't
Yeah.
understand.
Mhm.
And so you end up not sharing, not telling, not wanting to like share versus knowing other people that had gone through the same experience makes it a little bit easier to feel understood, to feel witnessed, to feel connected to
Yeah.
other people sharing a similar experience and to know what that feels like. Because I remember right towards the end, my brother got pretty bad, and I remember there was moments where it just seemed like I started to get protective of my parents even because he'd go on benders
Oh
and they
yeah.
would be
Mhm.
so worried of how he would show up. And I just remember seeing it was like destroying the family unit. And
Hmm.
I remember writing in my journal, like sometimes I wish it would be better if he was gone. And so I had to
Hmm.
initially process working through my own guilt and judgment and shame around that piece of like, oh, wishing it and then he goes versus
Yeah.
going, oh, we were just in a lot of pain because the addiction overrode the family. And so that I think a lot of
Hmm.
people struggling with it, it becomes like a night and day survival response where you almost get PTSD, if you will, from that
You don't almost, you
survival
do. You have PTSD. Hmm.
from constantly having your nervous system in that fight or flight survival. And oftentimes, I'm curious if you see this too. It seems like I know in our family unit, there is addiction, and I think it came from like here's my theory. I don't know if it's correct or not, but my theory is I tracked my parents to my grandparents and the alcoholism that ran through the family. And I think initially both my grandfathers were in World War II, and there wasn't any support, and there's not a lot of support still for veterans. And so I feel like that unprocessed grief turned into drinking, which then recreated the dynamic of, my parents growing up in similar households where the
Hmm.
drinking became the way to make life feel better, the pleasure point, which
Hmm.
then inherently transferred back through the family unit. So um, I think a lot of times it's in the family unit. And so another reason to work through some of these pieces is so that we don't just keep recreating the same um, parts of our body that get because it's neurobiologic, right? Like so it's
Hmm.
passed down in the biology, but if that's our biology and our reaction, our nervous system reactions to cope create that same environment and that same stress
Yeah.
response is what it feels like. So the dopamine, high stress, constant state of survival, I need a release or a pressure or a pleasure from that is almost
Hmm.
feels like it recreates the epigenetics of recreating that over and over again. Is that how it happens
Yeah.
in family units?
Yeah, so there isn't super conclusive um, results to this. We don't really know. Okay. What we know is that there is an interaction between nature and nurture when it comes to substance use disorder. Okay. So I think all of those things you mentioned are all factors. So I think that there are probably, we know that there's some sort of genetic component to it that's just literally in the genes, could be epigenetics, right? We added these substances and our brains learned that they help remove pain and now it's in our genes, right? We know that there's a factor. We know that trauma um it rewires the brain, right? Especially traumatic childhoods, but even in adulthood, it literally rewires the brain. So that's another factor. We know that growing up in a household with somebody that has alcoholism creates trauma. You see how all of this, so it's multifaceted, and how you get there or what you come into it. There are people that literally, Chris Heron was one of them, our founder. He took his first hit of cocaine and it was done. It was done. There was no turning back there for him. So people like to argue that whether or not addiction is a choice. Okay. And I my thought and what I say to that now is yeah, and but for some people that was day one. That was the only time they had a choice, right? And how many of us don't have a day one with substances? There aren't many. I know a couple of people that have never touched a drink. And when I say that, people often think the bigger substances. No, I mean alcohol too. Most of us have had a day one. And for some people, that was the first day that they felt themselves. So of course, if you're a teenager, you don't even have a fully functional prefrontal cortex yet, which means you have no impulse control. You have no ability to see the future yet and see consequences. So they don't even have the ability to do that. And they take their first drink of alcohol and all that anxiety that they've been carrying around from them is gone and they can socialize, which is all they've ever wanted to do. And we expect them not to continue to do that. Like
Hmm.
to me, actually, when you look at human behavior, it would be more insane for that person not to continue to do it than to do it. It makes more sense to me biologically for that person to continue to use. And then the use just continues to increase, right? And it moves to different substances. So it and this is the stuff I want people to know. I want parents to understand this, right? That if you're first of all, if your go-to as a parent is to come home and use alcohol when you're stressed, your kid sees that. If they already have maybe some trauma, maybe some genetic predisposition towards substance use, maybe some anxiety, genetic predisposition towards anxiety, and they see that, what do they think they're going to do when they have a bad day? We teach them, right? And then that first day, they take that sip of alcohol, and that might be the last time they had a choice, right? So we have to be aware of all this. I've been telling my kid this since he was 8 years old because I want him to understand when he picks up that drink, that first drink, he's opening that door, which he has. And it's a scary thing as a parent because it's a different world. And my goal when I work with parents, my goal with my own child is to be a safe enough place where he can come to me and talk to me about it. I don't want him to hide it. I want him to be able to come to me and say, Mom, this is what I did. I need help, right? Or I need you to come pick me up.
Yeah, what I love about this is it's reframing addiction as the solution to a lot of family dynamics, which are
Hmm.
unstable, dysregulated, filled with trauma,
Yeah.
pain, heartbreak, sadness, without the right type of community or connection or solutions.
Yeah.
We go to what feels best to get us out of that. So it renormalizes anybody struggling or that has maybe some judgment on their children or what they did as parents to create this right or wrong versus going, oh, this is my child's solution to getting out of addiction, or my parent's solution, or my
Hmm.
solution to getting out of
Right.
pain. So that kind of absolves or normalizes some of the pieces from it versus
Yeah.
what we have to do to learn to move through that when we're ready, right? When we're ready to
Right.
actually move through that. What
Yeah.
what what comes up most often during the holidays in your grief support groups? Like, is there certain things that are like certain themed topics that would be useful for anybody listening that may be struggling with this holiday season?
Yeah. I mean, I think being happy during the holidays is one of the hardest things for most people to do, right? Because you've got, I just was, we actually did this today with our staff. We had one of our grief counselors come and talk to our staff about how to help loved ones through the holidays. And what a woman who has lost two children to substance use disorder, what she disclosed was that was really hard for her the first couple years for her to get holiday cards
Hmm.
to see the happy families. And she basically said, and I had never thought of that, right? She said, send them a card just saying, thinking of you, hope you're okay, instead of your happy family on the front of a card, right? So I think and it's the same thing with even some seasons. People struggle more in the summer, right? It's like when other people are happy and enjoying and you are like torn apart, it becomes really difficult to move forward. So I think my advice is wherever you are in your grief, let yourself be there. If you're mad, feel the anger. Go punch a punching bag, right? Scream in a pillow, swear, talk to somebody that's safe, scream, yell. Feel that emotion. If you're sad, be sad. It's okay if you don't participate in the holidays this year, right? Don't show up for other people. Do what you need to do this year. And if you need to have a smaller holiday or you need to change or you need to do something that celebrates your loved one in some way, do it, right? Don't tell yourself you're wrong. One of the other things I see all the time is people apologizing for their grief to the people around them, right? Like, I'm sorry, I'm just not in good space, or I'm really angry, I'm sorry, or they start talking about their loved one, which they think brings the room down, and then they apologize. No, celebrate them, say their name. Hang out with the people that are comfortable saying their name and telling stories. And, like we live in a society that has pathologized grief, and that's just insane to me, right? We don't get to live without dying. It's part of the process. And we have to be able to see that to normalize it because unfortunately, it's normal. Tragedy is not necessarily normal, but unfortunately it is a part of life, right? But death itself is normal.
Hmm.
And we have to be able to sit in it to some degree. I often say my grandmother, who was the closest person to me, she was born in 1910. And when I was a child, she used to tell me, make sure you have three children, because then if you lose one, you still have a family. Grief and loss was a normal part of life for us for most of our, most of our existence for humans. But in the last, you know, 50, 60, 70, 80 years, our science has come so far that now death is seen as a tragedy almost no matter when somebody passes or how. And that's just not realistic, right? And I had to look towards Buddhism to kind of find more understanding of that. I think faith is a big area where we can move towards. And again, getting through the holidays, getting through grief. I think spirituality for human beings is really where it's at. We got to explore it to some degree.
Yeah, it's also just for some of the research I've done, like everything's zipped up, right? It used to be people would die around you. You were very familiar with that. And
Hmm.
now it's like we don't see any of it. It's like
Oh
nipped
yeah.
and tucked away where it's brought away from you. So I know after my brother's death, like we didn't want to see his body because they said he'd turned blue.
Hmm.
I was worried about because we made like a family bond. We all wanted to see him, but I was worried about my mom.
Right.
And so we just chose not to, but I was so scared and fearful because it had been conditioned as this big, scary thing. And afterward, years later, when I started doing research, I met a bunch of death doulas and they totally changed my whole perspective where there's a home funeral where you can bring them to your home and
Yeah.
spend time with the body and like really look at it in a very different way. And then just in a
Hmm.
one conversation of trying to understand more, I felt my whole nervous system relax. And then I almost felt some guilt, like, oh, I wish I had this information and knowledge then because I would have handled it very different. I think it would have
Right.
allowed us to grieve much easier because you would have been around the body for a couple of days. You would have been to lay
Yeah.
with them, talk to them, almost
Hmm.
like you can see it versus when it
Yeah.
happens, you never see anything again. You just see ashes or you see a funeral. If it's not an open casket funeral, there's this disconnect from
Hmm.
death. And so I think again, there's just a lot of uninformed nature. So it forces us to almost work harder as a culture to lean into our grief, to face death, to do these things. Because if not, it's
Yeah.
such a big shock because it's been cleaned up and like we don't want anything messy in our society.
Yeah. We pretend like it doesn't exist. And
Mhm.
then when it happens, because it happens to all of us, right? When we're faced with it, we have no idea what to do because nobody's taught us. I was lucky. My grandmother I spent a lot of time with her. And I think I was 23 when she passed and she had cancer. Um, and I took care of her when she was dying. And she taught me, like she said to me, I taught you to live and now I'm going to teach you how to die.
Mm.
And she gave me a great gift because I was in the room with her after she passed and she was probably one of the first beside my grandfather, but one of the first real meaningful relationships in my life that I lost. And it was the best gift I've ever gotten, that she allowed me to be a part of that process and made me feel safe and gave me some sort of context for it. And I feel like that's what we need to do for our loved ones. We need to learn about this and we need to change this in our culture because it's hurting us more. It's not helping us. It's just creating so much pain.
Mhm. Yeah, I agree. I just had a thought too coming in. Let's say somebody ends up listening to this and they've been dealing with a family member that has addiction and they've
Hmm.
never talked to anybody, they've never done any research, they've purely been on their own and
Yeah.
this is a brand new conversation. I'm just curious, what would be helpful for them to understand? Either just awareness. I think we've talked a little bit about awareness about what's happening around it. What about for
Right.
them? What are some steps for them that would be helpful? Is it learning to set boundaries for themselves? Is it learning to do self-care? Like, because I know all that gets really difficult. I know I was more an enabler and didn't know how to put boundaries around my brother to find some sort of connection. What would be
Hmm.
helpful for somebody listening that has no awareness or has never gone to anybody or what would you say to them?
Two things. First one, get yourself some support. Find a support system. Okay. Get to a therapist that understands don't just go to any therapist. Go to a therapist that specializes in substance use disorder. Um, Learn about the disease because when we understand what it is we're dealing with, it becomes less personal. When you can understand the neurobiology behind it, it's not where we go to as family members. At least I know where I went to is, why am I not enough?
Mm,
Why doesn't he love me enough to stop this?
mm,
And learning about the disease, I started to understand it was never about me. It was always a protective mechanism for him, right? It was always about him. It was always about him and his pain. He never meant to hurt me. He loved me very much, right? So that's number one. Number two is figure out what you won't accept anymore, right? And then in that therapeutic context, figure out how to set a boundary around it and what the consequence is going to be. That's what keeps us safe. When we
mm,
can learn what I won't do and also what I will do. What am I willing to do? What has happened? You got to really look at what's happened in the past. What have you done that hasn't worked? Right? What have you done over and over and over again that hasn't worked? Because that's what we do. Within this realm, we want to continue to do the same thing and get a different result, but we never do. Right? So, but we keep doing it over and over again. At least I know I did. And that's what a lot of the families I work with do. So look at those things, break it down in therapy, right? And do it differently. You don't necessarily have to do the right thing this time because you don't know what that's going to be yet, but just do something different, right? Once you learn about the disease and you learn about how the brain works within it, and you see what you've been doing that hasn't worked, you can start to figure out where your boundaries need to be, right? In conjunction with what can I no longer tolerate? Because here's the other thing that happens to family members is we cease to exist. We start to exist solely for them and their disease. Our feelings don't matter, right? And we don't think our feelings matter. Like I can't tell you how many times in the beginning of my career I would say to a mother, well, you need to look at yourself. And she'd get so mad at me and she'd be like, I'm not the problem, right? Like he or she just needs to stop this. Right. And then I started to realize that when we're in this, we're just as sick as they are.
Mm.
Right. We are living entirely to save them. And another interesting fact to I'm a brain junkie. Okay. I love the brain. I have a degree in neuroscience. And there's a study that's coming out of Texas University, I believe it is, where they're studying the brains of people who have active substance use. And it's functional MRIs that they're doing, and they're doing scans of the brains of their family members. The same exact area of the brain lights up when the person is thinking of their drug of choice as when the family member is thinking about saving their loved one or their loved one getting to treatment. We become addicted. Okay. And you can see this, and it's oftentimes the moms, but the dads do stuff too. I've seen siblings do it as well, where we find ourselves in situations that we can't believe we don't even understand what we're doing or how we got there or why. I mean, I've had little old ladies meeting drug dealers in back alleys at, 12 at midnight just to pay them off so they don't hurt their loved one, right? And they're like, how the hell did I get here?
Mm.
Right? So understanding that we're not well either. And in order to help them, most of the time we have to help ourselves, right? So starting with getting the support for ourselves and figuring out the boundaries and what the consequence is going to be when the boundary is crossed. And that's the hardest. It's probably the hardest part of all of it.
Yeah, it's really difficult because you're almost there's a letting go or a surrender
Mhm.
to that, which is really hard when you really love
Mhm.
somebody. But if not, we go down with them is the unfortunate thing. And
Yeah.
it seems like I found people are ready when they're ready, and sometimes it takes rock bottom, and sometimes rock bottom doesn't do it, and they keep going. And so it's almost like the disease takes them where they want to go. It's just how do we protect? What
Mhm.
I'm hearing from you say is how do we protect ourselves to still love them as best we can, but not let the
Mhm.
disease take us down with them.
Yeah.
And finding out how to do that can be a really difficult process. That's why you need support. That's why you need community. That's why you need therapy. That's why you need support to navigate
Yep.
that, to help understanding what's happening. And so you can see yourself clearly. Because I know our family
Mhm.
didn't see ourselves when my brother was in it and we were all in it with him. And I've also in my addiction
Mhm.
seen how that's affected different things in my life. So super, super
Yeah.
useful.
I can't see it. And this is one thing I always want to make sure that people understand is when my ex-husband, he goes in and out, okay? And I can't see things clearly, even though this is what I do for work. There are people that come to me as an expert to ask my advice, and I can navigate them all day long. But when I'm in it with him, I can't trust my thinking because I'm too emotional. This is why we need people in our lives to help us navigate it, right? Because you can't, I'm not allowed to treat my loved ones for good reason. Because when they start making poor choices, all my enabling and all my anger and all my anxiety comes up, and my brain doesn't work anymore.
Mhm.
Right. So we need this help. We need somebody to call. Like one of the best tools that I give families is space. Take space. It's an underutilized tool that we have. If your loved one asks you to do something and you're not sure, but the pressure is the immediate gratification, right? Because that's what happens. We have to learn to say, I'm not sure about that right now. I'll get back to you, regardless of how angry they might get on the other side. And then we need to use that space to call somebody, like phone a friend, right? Call someone, go to therapy and say, this is what they've asked me for, and I don't know if I should do it or not. I don't feel right about it, and process it and break it down and come up with a plan before we go back, right?
Mm.
Because that immediate gratification that they're asking us for, that we have signed on and we do, right? They call us for 20 bucks. We're like, yeah, sure. Here's the 20 bucks. Because we don't want to deal with the other side of it, because we know how angry they're going to get when we say no, right? It becomes a very difficult thing to navigate. So take space.
Which almost becomes the addiction, is us reinforcing that again and again and again and again, versus
Hmm.
the space starts to change, create some space
Right.
to actually decide and have a choice in the matter versus repeating the
Yeah.
pattern.
Right. Well, on the other side, you mentioned hitting rock bottom. That is a term I don't like because it feels punitive to me.
Mm.
And we know this is a disease. So I've moved away from using that. And I talk more now about helping somebody move towards wanting recovery. And
Mm.
what I've recognized that is our loved ones, there's literally like a scale. It's almost like they have a devil and an angel on every shoulder, right? On each shoulder. And the part of the brain that wants the drugs is every time they have a difficult feeling, they have zero coping skills, it's going to tell them to go use the drug. And then there's the cortex, which is the angel, that's the thinking part that shuts off inactive addiction,
Mm.
that would tell them they need to go, um, that they shouldn't because this creates more pain. What we want to do in the beginning stages, they have to choose between pain and pain. They have to choose between the pain of active use, which has a reprieve because they don't feel it when they're on the drug, right? And the pain of sitting in sobriety or sitting in, the lack of using that coping skill. So that's literally, they don't, in their mind, they're like, I can't win here. It's pain or pain. Now we know, us people who have normally functioning cortexes, that there's one side of that scale that will move towards happier times, right? More well times, better times. But they don't know that yet. So how do we help them do that? Is we have to make them as uncomfortable as possible in their use, in their addiction. So when they come to us and ask us for $20 and we know they've spent all their money on drugs, we got to start saying no. We want them to sit without electricity in their apartment. We want them uncomfortable. And it's so hard as a family member to do, right? To
Mm.
say, I love you, but I can't keep paying your electric bill. I'm here the second you want to get help, the second you want to go to rehab. I'm here. I'll drive you. But that's all I can do right now, right? If you're hungry, I'll meet you and we can have coffee and I'll buy you a meal. But I'm not filling your shelves with food, right? Because we make it too comfortable. We want the pain of active use, that side of the scale, to become more painful than the pain of sobriety. We want to tip it, right? And we want to use natural consequences, not punishment, which is where this becomes so tricky, which is why you need professional help to do it. Because you get so mad, you just want to punish. We want to move away from that. We want natural consequences. You spent all your money on drugs. Now you don't have enough money for your electric bill. That's a natural consequence of the use, right? So I've done webinars on all this stuff and I could talk about this for hours. So if anyone is interested in them, they're free. They're on our YouTube channel, Aaron Project YouTube channel. I talk about this all the time. We talk about this in our groups all the time. So if you want more information on how to do that, people can just go to our site, go to our YouTube channel. But that's the crux of it. It's not, let's wait until somebody loses everything, including maybe their life, right?
Mm.
It's, let's learn how to help them using boundaries and consequences that will keep us safe and also potentially help them move towards wanting recovery. And recovery and abstinence are two different things, right? That's the other thing I want to mention is recovery is an active process and somebody can be having some reoccurrences of use and still be moving towards recovery. And somebody can be abstinent and not in recovery at all
Mm.
because it's the behaviors that are the problem, not the substance, right? And that's a shift in our thinking that we kind of have to get to. Kind of goes back to that whole idea of all we do is challenge the use as opposed to looking at the actual problem.
So
So I
the
know I said a lot there, but
so the recovery is moving towards getting this out of the brain. And if I'm hearing you, it's learning how to be with those down states or uncomfortable states and turning on the front of the brain, which I teach a lot of
hmm
nervous system and regulation practices. So it's turning this part on to think,
yeah,
I know this is get me out of my pain and it's an easy quick fix and I have more pain here. So I'm going to
Yeah.
choose the route of going into B and feel with some of this pain, which will be painful.
Hmm.
But if I can continue to do that in the moments of pain, I move towards recovery and I continue to shore up my dopamine centers when they learn, because it's the pleasure release. So if I start to associate, I get out of pain, but it equals more pain. And here I sit in pain, but it equals pleasure afterward. And I start to rep that again and again and again. That's how I start to build into recovery. Is that the kind of the big picture, how we move towards that?
Yeah. Yeah. And you hear people a lot say when they're in recovery, you ask somebody what finally changed, and they'll say it stopped working. So I was in pain while I was using. I was in pain while I was participating in my addiction, right? So that we want to help them get there. We want to help them get to the point where it stops working, which means that the pain is higher when they're actively using, which is the consequences, right? That's what brings the pain. And a lot of times, us family members follow them around with a dustpan and a broom, and we clean up all their messes. And that's where we have to stop doing it. And we feel like if I do that, they're going to die. And as you unfortunately know, it's a reality.
Mhm.
Um, and people, and that's what I always say to families when I work with them, there's no judgment. You do what you need to do because this is a deadly disease and we have to acknowledge that. But the reality is have they gotten better with you doing that?
Hmm.
Has the risk of them dying lessened? No, right? It's like a false sense of control that we have, and it's for us more than them. And that's where we have to learn to sit in our anxiety and pull back a little bit and let them be a little cold and hungry, right? Because we want that part of this part of the brain to go, hold on a second. We're hungry and we need drugs, right? Two competing things that you need to survive, right? We want that competition,
Hmm.
right? We don't want them to have a full belly and be sitting warm so they can use comfortably. We don't want that anymore, right? But it's so difficult as a family member because we're dealing with a deadly disease,
Hmm.
right? And you could choose that and you might never see them again. And you have to be ready for that, right? So being real about that is a really important part of the education process because I'm not going to sit here and tell you, well, everything's going to be okay if you make that choice because I can't make that promise. I wish I could. I hope someday I can, but I can't today, right? So we have to acknowledge that. And it's having these really difficult discussions where people can make choices, understand the disease, and then make a choice based on what they're ready to do as a loved one.
So, so valuable. I just love it because I mean, I know a little bit about addiction. I mean, I went to Al-Anon, I went to some other pieces, but it's been so informative just hearing your perspective, your lens
Mhm.
of how looking to the world. I think it removes a lot of bias and judgment that gets
Yeah,
projected onto addiction. And also a lot
right.
of just really useful tools and resources for people to go to. And so I want to also just re-hit about that again is like go to
Mhm.
heronproject.org. There's
Yep.
support groups, there's videos, there's content. It sounds like also Heron Project YouTube. There's a lot of videos on there as well for more
There's
information.
YouTube. Yep. Yep. And we also have a program where we help people find their way to treatment. So if your loved one is struggling, they can call. They have to call, guys. The family members that are watching, you can't call. We need to talk to them, and that's because it's an important part of the assessment process. And no treatment center is going to take them without talking to them. But they can call us, and we'll also find them. I mean, depending on what they want. So I don't want to say find them their way to treatment, but we'll help them on their road to recovery. And we'll walk with them the whole way. So no matter where they're at, we'll stay with them. We'll offer some resources. We'll try to help them use their resources to find something to help.
Hmm.
So
Hmm.
we work with both the family and the individuals. It's kind of and we have a prevention program as well. So all of that is up on our website.
Amazing. I love what you guys are doing, and I can see you're
Thank you.
really passionate about this work. And so thank you
Yeah,
so much
I
for
am.
this work and fighting this disease and really helping
Hmm.
families fight this disease and then process if they can't and they go through the death process around it. And so it's just really meaningful
Hmm.
deep work. And so I have so much respect for you and what you guys are doing at your organization. And thanks so much for joining us today on this call and shedding some more light around addiction, loss, and moving through the holidays with some of these same challenges. So
Yeah, thanks for having me, Joshua. I love this. This is awesome.